We have three panelists, Jim and Molly and Tony, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves, but as you can see, Tony's not here. He's going to pop in and pop out. So we do anticipate him. He'll be joining us shortly. It's appropriate that the first panel take a look at the Sustainable Development Goals. There are 17 of them, but they're broken into 169 associated targets. And it's anticipated that we will achieve these targets, accomplish these targets by 2030. Quite ambitious. So it's important that we take a look at the SDGs from the get-go, what it means, and put them into context. So to get us started, I'll turn it over to someone who helped make this workshop happen, Jim Mercy.
Thanks, Shelley. Good morning, everybody. It's always great to be at the forum because it's one of the few places I go where I don't have to convince people about the importance of violence prevention. We can just talk about how to do it. So it really is wonderful to be here. I'm going to talk about three things. I'm going to talk a little about why the SDGs are important, why goals are important in general. Second, I want to talk about the relationship of the SDGs to violence. And third, I want to make some suggestions about what we need to do if we're going to make a measurable difference to move towards the targets that are set for different types of violence in the SDGs. I'm going to try to emphasize the hope and possibility in the SDGs related to violence. There are many concerns and legitimate issues that need to be discussed. How do we get attention to violence in 17 goals and 169 targets that make up the SDGs? How do we measure these things to show that we're making progress? But I'm really going to focus on the hope and possibility that they offer to us as a field. I want to thank Alex Bouchard from WHO, whom most of you, if not all of you, know, for sharing his slides and ideas for this presentation. He gave a presentation at the WHO Milestones on Violence Prevention meeting last fall in which he focused on this, and so I've drawn heavily on his ideas and slides. Well, what are the SDGs? They're basically a new universal set of goals, targets, and indicators that UN member states are expected to use to frame their development agendas and political policies through 2030. They're aspirational in nature, so they talk about ending poverty, ending hunger, eliminating violence. And they follow on the Millennium Development Goals, which were agreed upon by governments in 2001, and were due to expire, actually expired the end of 2015. So they're very important in the global development agenda. And so to get violence into them, I think, in any way, is an important advancement for our field. Here's a quote from President Kennedy that I really think expresses quite beautifully what we hope for from goals and targets like this. By defining our goal more clearly, by making it seem more manageable and less remote, we can help all people to see it, to draw hope from it, and to move irresistibly towards it. Now, there's a story behind the speech in which this quote was included. It was included in a speech by President Kennedy at American University in 1963 on violence prevention, actually. It was on world peace and nuclear proliferation. And in that, some people say that it is one of the most important speeches of the modern presidency. And in that speech, he actually called for a movement towards world peace and focusing on nuclear non-proliferation, and announced he was going to negotiate with the Soviet Union around nuclear test bans. So I think it's very apt that this quote about the hope we see and possibility we see for goals was included in that speech. Jeffrey Sachs, in an article he wrote about why Sustainable Development Goals matter, identified 4 things I think that are really important about the value of these goals, and that they can encourage social mobilization because they help the world move in a common direction. By setting a goal, you help, if people can rally upon it, they move in a common direction. Also creates the possibility of peer pressure, because government leaders can be asked, what are you doing to achieve this goal? It can be compared with other countries, across countries. Why is this country doing this? Why aren't you trying to move more quickly on this issue, or more adroitly? So peer pressure can be created to move countries and leaders in a common direction. It can also spur the development of networks of expertise, knowledge, and practice, and even mobilize stakeholder networks that brings together community leaders, donors, religious groups, politicians, businesses. In fact, Susan Bissell is going to talk later about the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children. This is a clear example of this type of result from the creation of the SDGs, and particularly around violence. So the Millennium Development Goals did not include any targets or indicators that related to violence. They're credited with leading to a lot of achievements, particularly around poverty reduction and other things. So they're very important and have made an important contribution. But now in the Sustainable Development Goals, there are included 4 targets. Now I emphasize these are not goals. They are targets under broader goals that are contained within the SDGs. And you can see how they're phrased in aspirational form. Target 5.2 calls for elimination of all forms of violence against women and girls. Target 5.3 calls for elimination of all harmful practices such as child, early and forced marriage, and female genital mutilation. Target 16.1 calls for significantly reducing all forms of violence and related death rates everywhere. And 16.2 calls for end of abuse, exploitation, and trafficking, and all forms of violence against children. So what more could we ask for, right? I think the significance of these is that, as far as I know, this is the first time that the world has come together and established agreed upon targets for reducing violence. I think that's that's an evolution in our world, in the sense that we can have finally come together and said collectively that we are going to work together to try to achieve these targets. But are the SDGs more than just these targets on violence prevention in terms of their importance for violence prevention? Actually, they are. In addition to these targets, if you look at the goals, there are many issues that address risk factors or protective factors that relate to violence prevention. The goals around no poverty, around good health, around quality education, around gender equality, reduced inequalities, sustainable cities and communities, and peace and justice all speak directly to some of the risk factors that we recognize as important in this area. So this agenda is more than just those 4 targets that I outlined for you. Here's another way of looking at it, but along the left-hand side are 3 of the targets areas for the SDGs, and on the top are sort of a summary of the risk factors and protective factors that relate to violence prevention, each of these types of violence actually that are important. Social protection and poverty reduction, for sure, preventing and treating harmful drug and alcohol use, ending discrimination against women and girls, enhancing early childhood development, safe housing and urbanization, and rule of law and justice for all. So in the SDGs, one could argue we have a broad agenda for violence prevention framed around these goals and targets. So what should we do to translate these lofty aspirations for preventing violence into measurable progress by 2030? I want to make some suggestions I think are things we ought to consider, because I think in order to make this kind of progress, the kind of progress we hope for, you have to make choices. You have to focus your efforts in some reasonable ways. So here are some ideas that maybe we can discuss more. One, I think you have to target prevention efforts towards the highest risk countries and regions. To try to prevent violence in the whole world, everywhere, I think is a lot to ask. These are data from WHO on global trends in homicide rates by income level. And what you see clearly here is between 2000 and 2012 that homicide rates have declined pretty substantially in high-income countries. Less so, but to some extent, in low and middle-income countries. But clearly, the majority of deaths from interpersonal violence from homicide, the great majority, occur in low and middle-income countries, and their rates are substantially higher. So I think that is an important target, low and middle-income countries. In addition to that, here is looking at this in a little bit different way by region. And you can see here that two regions clearly stick out in terms of trends over the past decade or so in homicide. The highest region is actually the Americas, and actually, since 2007, rates have actually increased in the Americas in contrast to the rest of the world. And they're followed by Africa. So I think you can make a strong argument that a particular focus should be made on the Americas and Africa in terms of regions of the world in which to focus efforts. I think another thing that's important is that we need to act on the cross-cutting nature of violence. Here's the many forms of violence that we address in this field. But the thing about it is they're linked in many ways. They share common risk and protective factors. Perpetrators often perpetrate multiple forms of violence. Victims often suffer multiple forms of violence. Some violence is a cause of other forms. Child maltreatment, for example, is a risk factor for intimate partner violence, perpetration, and victimization. There's many, many interconnections among these, and yet we often address them as if they're siloed. So how do we take advantage of the interconnections? How do we take advantage and address the cross-cutting risk and protective factors instead of trying to deal with each one independently? I think that's a huge opportunity and something we ought to think carefully about. Prioritizing environmental change. Here's something called the Health Impact Pyramid. It comes from a paper by Tom Frieden, who's the director of CDC, and he does not make me put this in my presentations. But what it's trying to emphasize is that the kinds of interventions that address individuals or small groups are very important, don't get me wrong. But they take, in order to scale up and implement in a broad way to really make population change, they take incredible individual effort, and they cost a lot. In contrast, interventions, policies that get at the underlying socioeconomic factors, changing the cultural context that gives rise to violence in our case, have the possibility of much greater population impact. And so we know much more about the interventions in violence prevention at the top of this pyramid than we do at the bottom. I think we need to pay much greater attention to trying to focus on policies and social determinants of health that underlie violence and are represented at the bottom of this pyramid, because in the end, that is what's going to achieve the greatest population impact. Here are some examples of different areas where we could focus efforts to change the environment. Access to lethal means, alcohol, poverty and equity, social norms. So there's a lot to do in this area, and incredibly important for making progress. In addition, I really believe that we need to focus on preventing violence among children and youth. One of my favorite quotes is from Jack Shonkoff, who says the most powerful way to change the world is to make it a better place for kids. And I would add to that the most powerful way to make it a better place for kids is to focus on reducing their exposure to violence. But here's the reasons. One is that violence disproportionately impacts children and youth. The perpetrators and victims of violence across the world are primarily children and youth. In the United States, adolescent children are at twice the risk when compared to all adults of rape, assault, homicide. So I think you can make a strong case that this is important to focus on children and youth because of the disproportionate impact. Violence against children and youth is a risk factor for future violence, as we just talked about. So if you can prevent it at a younger age, you can impact violence experience, victimization, perpetration at older ages. Our strongest evidence for violence prevention is actually on interventions for children and youth. And finally, children and youth experience all forms of violence. Oftentimes when I say violence against children, people think you're talking about child maltreatment. But almost every type of violence we talk about, from child maltreatment to bullying to peer violence to teen dating violence to intimate partner violence to sexual violence, affects children. So I think this is worthy of thinking about as a focus if we're really going to make measurable progress. I think we also have to act on the best available evidence. We don't have perfect knowledge about how to prevent violence, but we have enough knowledge and know enough, and the problem is large enough that we need to act now. I don't think we can wait for perfect knowledge in which to take actions to prevent violence. One of the things that's happening globally is that WHO, World Bank, PEPFAR, the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children, UNICEF, are all coming together around creating a common package of the best available evidence to prevent violence against children. And this slide reflects what that package will contain, although the title of the package will not be Thrives. However, I want to emphasize the importance of this, to have all of those major global players to come together and agree upon a common set of best available evidence in these areas outlined here is an incredible development, and I think also reflects that possibility that Jeffrey Sachs talked about of how Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs, and goals in general can mobilize action. And finally, we need to build capacity and infrastructure needed to scale up violence prevention. We know a lot about the problem. We know we're learning a lot more about how to prevent it, but we don't have a lot of capacity infrastructure needed to really put what we know and learn into place. I think this is something we really need to put a lot of attention. Creating a workforce to implement violence prevention strategies. Who are the people that are going to do this? How do we train them? Where do they come from? How do we mobilize that effort? There are great efforts at synthesis and translation of what we know going on, but I think we even need to do a better job of getting the information out that we have so much of to people who need it to use it on the ground. Prevention support, how do we support the NGOs, the communities, the countries that are trying to implement violence prevention? And how do we create organizations that can be effective in delivering them? This is all part of the infrastructure and needs to be given very careful and focused attention. So in concluding, I'll leave you with this quote: "What you get by achieving your goals is not as important as what you become by striving to reach your goals." And I think really believe that the SDGs, that the targets included in violence and the SDGs in general offer a real possibility of making a safer world, a world with less violence, and for that I think we can be thankful. Thank you very much.